Okay, this is Screencast, chapters 4 and 5, part 3. We last left off with pattern, so we pick up this time with space. Now, space is a measurable distance between two established points. In three-dimensional space, it possesses thickness or depth as well as length and breadth. And in two-dimensional, it's the kind of illusion of that. Now, spatial organization deals with compositional layouts. Now, we have to talk about positive and negative space before we can go on from there. With positive space, it is the enclosed areas which represent the initial selection of shapes planned by the artist. So that's that red ball that we talked about on the white piece of paper. The red ball is the positive. The area around that red ball is the negative. So the negative space is the unoccupied spaces, which also function in shapes in the work. Make sure you take a look at that video link again. Now, perspective. Perspective is depth. It is the illusion of creating three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. This is really something that's learned. It's not really instinctual. There are different types of perspective. There is linear, atmospheric, isometric, and aerial. So linear perspective is the most realistic method. It's a method of portraying three-dimensional depth on a two-dimensional surface. It uses real or suggested lines converging on a vanishing point in the horizon line. So you can see here in the illustration, very common, all those lines are going towards that one spot on the horizon line called the vanishing point. Generally, this has been represented throughout art history as like railroad tracks, you know, the lines that are converging towards. Now, foreshortening also comes into play in perspective. It's a visual phenomenon where an elongated object projected toward or away from the viewer appears shorter than its actual length, as though it's compressed. This Montague piece is a really good example. You have, you know, Christ laying there, his feet are projected out at you, so the feet have to be as large, if not larger, than the head, which, if we start talking about art, it generally can be about the hand is the same size as the face, the feet are the same size from the elbow to the wrist. But when we look at this, imagine if I came up to you and I put my hand in your face about 3 inches from your face. My hand would look probably the same size, if not bigger than my head. Another example of foreshortening is page 109, figure 446 in your text. Now, atmospheric perspective is where forms that are meant to be perceived as distance from the viewer are blurred, indistinct, and misty. So this is a pretty good illustration here showing you that the dice that is close up, you can see bright color and things that are really clear and sharp. The one that's the farthest away is very misty gray, blurred. The colors are faded, very different than the one in the front. Atmospheric perspective is a really good, easy way to show depth. Now, isometric perspective is generally the one that everyone has a little bit more difficult time with, which is why I point that out. It is most commonly found in Eastern art. So we're going to see Eastern-looking art. When you look at this particular piece, isometric perspective is defined as resembling linear perspective, except that the parallel lines do not converge, which instead they are parallel to one another, but at an angle to the picture. So if you look at this here, everything is kind of parallel to one another, but you can see the depth. So what I usually show in class is that railroad track. If I zoom in on the railroad track, the tracks, the bars that go in between those tracks, they're farther apart the closer they are to you. But if I zoomed in on just that area of the bars in between without the tracks, then you'd have the area that would be closest to you is farther apart. Those horizontal lines will be farther apart. And then at the top of the painting, the lines would be really close together. So that's that isometric perspective, showing that depth through the horizontal. Now, aerial perspective is a point of view that is coming from a bird's eye view. I myself prefer aerial perspective. You can have a worm's eye view, a bird's eye view. Those are more visually interesting because things that we find boring and not interesting are things that we see in our everyday lives. So when somebody makes us see something a little bit different, that's where we find interest. So that's hopefully where the artistic view is coming from. Now, time and motion. Time is always a factor when it comes to how long it takes to make something, but also some art, it takes time for it to grow or develop. If we talked about artwork of the topiary at Disney World, things grow and change and flower. Okay, you also have kinetic art, which is art that incorporates movement. Usually we talk about domino effect. You know, someone who sets up a trail of dominoes, you hit it and the movement of it going through. It doesn't have to be as literal as that. It could be blinking lights. It could be the wind blowing and making something move. There's a great video link there. Sorry for the music. It is horrible. But there's great examples of kinetic sculpture in that video. Now, principles of design. Remember, we just did the elements, which are the ingredients for making a cake. Now we need the directions of how to bake that cake, and that's what the principles of designs are. So we have unity, variety, balance, emphasis, focal point, proportion, scale, and rhythm. I have them kind of paired up here because they go together. Unity and variety go together. Then there's balance. Then there's emphasis and focal point go together. And proportion and scale go together. Now, these are really guidelines. Artists hate to have rules, so they're just kind of a guideline to let us know, oh, this works, it's worked before. Now, remember where I said color and hue, same thing, but different names? Design and composition are the same thing also. So don't be confused by that when it's used throughout the lecture. Now, unity and variety. Unity is a sense of oneness of things belonging together and making up a coherent whole. And then variety is difference, which provides interest. So let's take a look at this Ben Jones piece. There is unity and variety in this piece. Both of those are in this piece. We have unity in the fact that it's faces, arms, and hands, and we have variety in the fact of the patterns and the color usage. There is an example of extreme unity here in the Andy Warhol 100 Cans pieces. Extreme unity, there's comfort in this, but there's also boredom that happens. Now, because I mentioned Andy Warhol, here you see an image of Andy Warhol. Famous artist, iconic, sort of like the Van Gogh, the Picasso name. Not as old as some of them, but I know he's been portrayed in movies and things like that. I think the last time I saw him, he was an alien in one of the last Men in Black movies. Not the one with Chris Hemsworth, but the one before that. Now here you see an example of what he's probably most famous for, aside from those Campbell soup can, is his silk screens of his celebrity portraits. So Marilyn Monroe piece here. Now, emphasis and focal point. Emphasis is where our attention is drawn to certain parts of the composition more than others. And then the focal point is that specific spot that you want someone's attention to be on. I'm going to go ahead and flip to the next slide, and then I'll go back to that subordination. Okay, this particular piece, the Francisco de Goya, has emphasis and focal point. So what do you think the emphasis is? It is the guy with his hands up in the white shirt, okay? He is our focal point. He is our one specific spot that the artist wants us to look at. Now, how do we have emphasis? What's directing our attention that way? Well, first off, those guys pointing guns at him, that's an emphasis. The light shining on him is another emphasis. And then we have the dead, bloody bodies at the bottom. That's an emphasis because we know what's going to happen because of those guns. Okay, so subordination. This is certain areas of the composition are made less visually interesting so that the areas of the emphasis stand out. So, let's say we have a crowded scene and we have tons of people, but we have only 2 people that are in focus. Everybody else is out of focus. That's subordination. We've taken and made those areas less interesting, all of those other people, so we want you to look at those two people. Something you might see in the movies. Okay, so how do we have emphasis? There's different ways do we have emphasis. The manipulation of light, placement, isolation, contrast, content. Here's a few examples. Manipulation of light, this Vermeer painting, you've got the light shining in on the young lady's face. Here, placement, we have different things placed throughout the composition as you get higher. You see the donkey halfway up, you see the castle when you get higher in the composition. That's emphasis by that placement. Okay, here we see isolation. Sometimes isolation can cause you to have just as much interest as you know, being the center of attention. Example, you have somebody who maybe wears dark colors, kind of hides away from people, doesn't associate with people. That really draws attention too. So that's an emphasis. Okay, so proportion and scale. These both have to do with size. So scale means a size relation to some constant or normal size. Page 129, figure 516. You'll see an example. And then proportion is size relationships between parts of a whole or between two or more items perceived as a unit. So scale. What does that mean? If you take a look in the text and look at that example, you'll see that huge garden trowel. A garden trowel normally is what, 18 inches maybe? I believe the garden trowel that you see there is probably 24, 25 feet. Okay, that's a scale issue. Dealing with it looks like what it's supposed to be. It's a real actual thing, but the size is so different. Okay, proportion, that size relationship being different, bobbleheads. You have a really big head on a little bitty body, sorry about that. A large head on a little bitty body. That's a proportional difference. Now, a contrast in proportion and scale is most noticeable when it's wrong. So people notice when something looks size-wise wrong. Now, rhythm and scale. Rhythm is a pattern of colors, lines, etc. that may be exact or varied and establishes a regular beat. That's the most important part. It establishes a regular beat. We know rhythm in music. We hear rhythm in music. But you visually see rhythm also. So example, red, white, blue, red, white, blue, red, white, blue. You hear it, but imagine seeing that red, white, blue. You can see that rhythm. Okay, now balance. This is an ordered relationship of opposing forces. There are three types of balance. There is symmetrical, asymmetrical, and radial. So symmetrical we consider to be a formal balance. This Anita Kuntz is a really good example of this. It's where the visual weight is the same on both sides. So we have a face. If we divided it down in the middle, you'd still have half a nose, half a mouth, and an eye on each side. In art, we even take it even further. And approximate symmetry. This is a really good example that approximate symmetry because of the tattoos. The tattoos are different on both sides. So the visual weight is the same, but because of the tattoos, it makes it approximate. Now, asymmetrical balance is what we consider an informal balance. So where it's weight distribution, you have a big ball on one side and a little ball on the other. The big ball is going to be much heavier. Normally we think of this as a right to left thing, but it can be also a top to bottom thing. Now, radial balance is where things radiate outward from a central point. So here you see the example of the flower or the rose window, two really good examples. Now, composition. This is the arrangement of the parts to construct a whole. This is the physical foundation of an artwork. Normally, we can talk about it and say it's design or it's composition. Now, there are four types of composition. There are vertical, horizontal, diagonal, and complex. We will pick up on the next screencast and finish out on that screencast with this section. So this is the end of part 3.